Hello. Dennis, you're already here, right?
Hello.
So I made you presenter. Sorry, a lot of people will be joining back. It was in room one that common session was going on. So let us wait for a few minutes and before we start, so they can join back in this room. Is that
Okay,
okay?
thank you. Okay, fine.
Okay, I'm going to mute myself and come back in a half a minute. Okay, I will
Okay,
inform other room.
okay.
So I think let's get started if they are joining because the other room had almost 60 people. So if they'll be joining slowly here, uh, so
Okay, let's start.
so let me so first of all, thank you for accepting to share your knowledge with this Power Platform Bootcamp. If I give a little bit introduction about Dance, is he is from Malta. How's weather over there?
Fine, fine. A bit cold, but
Mhm.
fine. What time is there for you? Are you in
It is
Canada, right?
1:34 p.m. right now. Uh,
1:30 p.m. Oh, it's starting of afternoon. Here is
yeah.
already evening for me.
Okay. And he's also a data platform. He has a lot in his portfolio. So if I tell one thing, it won't justify, but I will put his contact information in chat window and I will let him introduce in detail about himself. So then it is stage is yours.
Thank you very much. So, good afternoon. My name is Dennis Torres. I'll be talking about deployment pipelines in Power BI. Thank you very much for attending this session on this great conference. So, Thank you for the sponsors of this conference. Without the sponsors, this conference would not be happening. And this is me. I'm a data platform MVP with some certifications. As I was introduced, I live in Malta. I'm the Malta Data Platform User Group Leader. And on the right side of the screen, you can see all my contacts. Feel free to get in touch. It will be a pleasure to connect. And feel free to ask anything, any questions, and so on. Our agenda today, we'll talk about what are deployment pipelines in Power BI, how to set up deployment pipelines, how connections work in the pipeline, inside the pipeline, how do we share the pipeline with other users, and pipelines with multiple workspace. In fact, I mean linking objects between pipelines in this case. What are deployment pipelines? The work we do in Power BI is a development work. All the work we do in Power BI is a development work. We are developing a model, developing a report, data flow, and so the work is a development work. And as a development work, we need a development environment to test what we are building, a test environment for testers to approve and check what we built, and finally a deployment, a production environment to uh, publish what we built. So we need these environments. It's not only about publishing our reports to a workspace in Power BI. We need a development environment, a test environment, and a deployment environment. That's what deployment pipelines in Power BI brings to us. Deployment pipeline creates this stage, development, test, and production using the workspaces in Power BI. How do we set up a pipeline? Using a workspace, we get a workspace, and on the workspace we can click on an option that will appear for us, create a pipeline. When we start the creation of the pipeline, it will ask us, okay, you are creating a pipeline. This workspace that you are using now will be which stage of the pipeline? Will be development, test, or production? So the first workspace we use to create the pipeline will be one stage of the pipeline. Then the pipeline itself will need additional workspace for the other stage, for the test stage and for the production stage. So the pipeline organizes a set of workspace, and each workspace becomes one stage on the deployment pipeline. So the workspace will be one of the stages, and each stage will be a new workspace, as I was just explaining. And the Y shows the pipeline as a single element. Usually we are used to see workspace and see the content of the workspace. But we have another option on the UI to see the pipeline, to see the stage of a pipeline, the development, the test, and the production stage of the pipeline. Three workspaces in sequence. And there are two ways to create the workspace. When we create the pipeline, the first workspace becomes one of the stages. Then we have two stages that are open without a workspace on them. Let's say that we create a pipeline and we define the workspace as the development stage of that pipeline. So we don't have a workspace for the test environment and for the production environment. What happens with these stages? How the workspace will be created? There are two ways to create these workspaces. First way, I can deploy to the development stage, and from development stage, I promote my deployment to the test stage and then to the production stage. If I do on this way, promoting what I'm deploying, then every time I promote what I'm deploying, if there is no workspace on the other stage, it will be automatically created. Power BI will automatically create a workspace for us. The second way to choose a workspace for this stage is exactly this, choosing a workspace. Before deploying, without the need to already deploy, we can choose an existing workspace to be the test workspace and the production workspace for this pipeline. So the options to define this stage are choosing existing workspace or deploying through the workspace and letting Power BI to automatically create the workspace for us. So this is the why for a deployment pipeline. You can see on the why, the workspace for development is defined. At the moment, there is nothing published on the development workspace, but the workspace is defined. But for the test stage and the production stage, the workspace are not defined. And it's exactly how I said. To define the workspace for the additional stages, the test and production, I can publish it to the development and then deploy to the next stage. Since the workspace is not defined, it will be automatically created. The second option that we have to define this additional workspace is to select an existing workspace, how in the way this UI is offering to us, for us to select a workspace. We can select an existing workspace or deploy to the stage empty and Power BI will create a workspace for us. And here we see another example. Another image is an example of two stages. In this scenario, a deployment already happened to the first stage, development, and then the content of the development was already deployed to the second stage, to the test stage. But for some reason, the developer decided to make a change. Changed something and published it again to the development stage. And what happens? On the UI for the deployment pipeline, we have a compare option. We can compare the content of the stage. And Power BI tells us the difference between the stages. In this example, is telling us that the data set is different between the stages. And how the connection works in the pipeline. What do I mean about connection? For example, here I have a report and a data set. The report is using the data set. These two objects are connected between themselves. And the data set is connected to a data source. So the data set will be using a data source. And how this will work between the stages when I deploy these objects to another stage. How this will work? There is a feature called auto binding that changes the relation between the objects along the stages. What this means? This means on this image, these are two objects. When I deploy, or another two objects are being created here. But then the auto binding that exists on the deployment pipeline ensures that the report created here, deployed to here will be linked to the data set here and not to the original data set. So the link between the objects will be adjusted according the objects are deployed across the pipelines, across the stages of the pipeline. And for the external connection, the dataset is using a data source that is outside the control of the pipeline. We can define on the stages what are called rules. We can define rules to change the data source on each stage. So, for example, the development stage can connect to development database, the test stage can connect to test database, and the production stage to a production database. So each stage can connect to a different database. And we can achieve this by using the rules on each stage of the pipelines. And besides the rules for the data source, we can also have rules for parameters. The data set can contain parameters, and we can define rules to change the parameter value on each stage of the pipeline. So the development stage will have one parameter, test another value for the parameter, and production another value for the parameter. Here you see the window where we configure this. When we open the window to make a configuration of the rules, we have rules for the data source and rules for the parameters. And then we have the stages, and our objects will flow through the stages, moving from development to test and to production. So our objects will flow through the stages. Let's see a demonstration about this. Let me move to Power BI. I have here one demonstration that I'll be using on this session. Let me open here the queries. So Henry is asking here, how does environment in the context of PBI serve? If so, where does PBI desktop fit into this? The pipeline has the stages, but each stage is one workspace. We are assigning for each stage one workspace. And how Power BI Desktop fits on this? Power BI Desktop will publish the content for the workspace that you would like. You can publish the content from the Power BI Desktop to any workspace that you would like. You can. But the best solution is to publish the content to the workspace, that is the development stage, and then promote the content to the other stage. Does this answer your question, Henry? So here on Power Query, on this example, I'm using one parameter called starting price. I'm filtering the product table by the list price of the product table. The list price is on product here. So I'm filtering the product by the list price. I will try to find some list prices that will create a difference on the reports. Initially, the initial value is 0. This means that it will bring everything, every list price bigger than the starting price. So it will bring everything. Then we'll change this parameter value. And this report, this query and report is connected to, let me open here the SSMS, one development database, Adventure Dev. I have this development database. But I have also an Adventure test database and an Adventure which is intended to be the production database. So I have one database for each stage of the pipeline. So let's go to the portal, Power BI portal, where it is here. I have one workspace, PBI Summit pipelines. I'll create a pipeline using this workspace as a starting point. Let's call this first pipeline ADV Adventure pipeline. Adventure pipeline. And it asks me, okay, you are asking to create a pipeline, and we started from the PBI Summit pipelines. Would you like this first workspace to be at the development environment, the test environment, or the production environment? In my example, it will be the development environment. Assign. So this first workspace will be the development environment. Mind the difference between the UI on when we see a workspace, one specific workspace, and when we look to the entire pipeline. And the difference is not on the middle of the screen, but on the left side. If I would like to see one specific workspace, I go to the workspace. But in this case, I'm looking to the pipeline. So I access deployment pipelines on the left side. So I'll have the view of the pipeline as a whole. In this case, I'll see 3 workspaces of this pipeline. At the moment, it has only one. PBI Summit pipelines. Okay. Let me publish this example. So I'll publish this example to the workspace that I chose as the development stage. So it's PBI Summit pipeline. Select. Success. This example is published. So I already have here one dataset and one report. Show more. I can see the dataset and the report inside this workspace. I can open the report. And here it is, the report. Now I have the content of my development stage. Once I consider my development, let's say, complete, or I would like someone to test what I did, I deploy this to the test stage. Deploy to test. And since there was no workspace on test before, a new workspace will be created. And take a look on the name of the created workspace. It's the same name of the original workspace, but including test between brackets. The same name, but with test between brackets. And they can see the same content. Then I can define the deployment settings. On the deployment settings, I can define the rules for this stage. And the rules are defined on the dataset level. I mean, each dataset can have its rules on that stage. I have only a single dataset, so I choose the dataset, and we see the data source rules and the parameter rules, exactly how it was on the slides. Let's take a look on the data source rules, and it's showing to me the data source that my dataset uses. Okay, but what I would like to do with this data source, use the same or use a different one? I'm creating a rules because I would like to use a different one. So I'll change the database from Adventure Dev to Adventure Test. So my dataset, which was pointing to a dev environment, will now point to a test environment. So this is the data source rule. But now I'll create a parameter rule to change the parameter that we saw on Power Query. Starting price. The parameter we saw on Power Query. Let me see that I find a value that changes a bit the report. 1500. Okay, so I would like to see only the parameters with the list price from 1500. And I save. So now this test environment is pointing to a different database and has a different value for the parameter. In fact, it advises that the environment are different. But in this case, the difference happens because the rules that are defined on the environment. I can open this second report. Let's first refresh the dataset. Refresh now. So it identifies the new information, the new data source. And then I open the report. And here it is. The value that I put on the parameter was not enough to create a difference here. The reports are the same for now. But we saw that I changed the database and the parameter value used on this environment. Let's let's go back to the report. Let's imagine that I would like to change something on this report. No, the title is not good. Let's change the title on this report. Sales by category. Let's change the title. Category total. So I change the title and I publish again. To the development workspace. So it's published to the development workspace. Let's make a refresh here. Comparing. And now that I changed the title of the report and published it again to the development workspace, it shows that the report is different from the report which is on the test stage. To, to solve this, I can deploy again to the test stage. Continue. So I deploy it again to the test stage. My rules are still defined here, meaning the stage is still works using my rules. Okay. And now I can deploy to the production stage. From the test stage, I can deploy to the production stage. Let's take a look on the report first. Category totals on the test stage. And now I will deploy to the production stage. And the same will happen. It will create a workspace on the production stage. And absolutely the same will happen. That's it. No, the rule is still in place. Is still here. And I'll create a new rule now for the production. Henry asked if the rule was overwritten by the second promotion. No, it was not. It's still in place. And now I'm pointing to the production database and define a rule for the parameters. That's a good question, Henry. Henry is asking if the rule was not overwritten, why it now shows as it's the same. If when I usually define the rule, it shows us a difference between the data sets. That's a good question, Henry. Let me make a refresh on this data set on the test environment. It's asking me to adjust the settings of connection settings. Your data source credential can't be refreshed. Let me edit credentials. Okay. Refresh the data set. So the rule is in place. The dataset is refreshed with the credentials for the test for the test database. Oh, in fact, the new parameter. My bad. The new parameter changed a bit the report. This is the report on the test environment. This is the report on the test environment. Uh, I confess I'm not sure why it shows a difference at the first time that I set the deployment setting, but doesn't show this difference later. It appears to be some kind of glitch, but I don't have the information now. I will check, and if you would like to follow up with me by mail, you can. Let's double check the settings of connections of the production dataset. So I haven't refreshed these yet. Let me refresh. This dataset. Once I refresh this dataset, let's check the connection settings. Strange that it still shows the test there. I changed that. The rule changed that to inventory, to production. Let me open the report. Refresh. No, I clicked the wrong option, sorry. No, settings. Data source credential. It's still showing the credential for test. Strange, seems to take some moments to accept the second credential. On the second deployment, settings. Now it's showing the connection to the inventory. I'm sorry for this small glitch that we had here. It seems that the rules that I defined on the environment were only applied after I deployed the content for the second time. After I had deployed again, the rules were really applied on the dataset. So I can refresh now the dataset. And let's wait it finishes refreshing. And here we see the report. It is still similar to the previous one, a bit different to the test one because I changed the values of the parameters. I changed the values of the parameters. So the rules were applied only after I deployed for the second time because the first time it was deployed without the rules defined. The rules needs to be defined first. Okay. So until now, we saw this example, deploying a content for one stage and evolving this content, promoting this content to the other stage, promoting to test and promoting to production until now. Let's make this a bit more complex. First, sharing the pipeline reports. This I can show directly on the Power BI portal. The point is, the users who will see the report on the development stage are one set of the users. The users who will see the report on the test stage are a different set of users. And production, so on. And we can here define the workspace access. There is no difference for the configuration of access to a regular workspace. This is a shortcut on the pipeline UI to define the workspace access for each one of the stages. So we can define who will have access to production, who will have access to test, and who will have access to the development environment, who will have access to each one of these environments. Okay, now let's get back to the PowerPoint. Sharing the pipeline report, this is what I just illustrated. Each stage is a workspace, and we can configure access to the stages on the stage level. The pipeline UI provides a shortcut to the configuration of access to the stages. So it's a shortcut to configure the access to the stages. Just what we saw. Then, development across pipelines. For example, let's imagine that we are creating Power BI data flows. So we are creating Power BI data flows and we will leave these Power BI data flows in one workspace, a different workspace than the workspace where the data set and the reports will be. So we may have one pipeline for the workflow and a different pipeline for the report and the data set. One pipeline for the workflow and one pipeline for the report and the data set. And we may have a reference from one pipeline to another. How this reference across pipelines is managed. Pipelines objects can be linked to another pipeline. This can happen. A dataset can use a data flow from other pipeline. This is an example. The pipeline deployment will ensure the relation between the stages. So when we set to the test stage, it will be linked to the data flow on the test stage, and so on. So there will be a link between the stages. The root pipeline needs to be deployed first. Root pipeline, I mean, this example, the data flow. The data set depends on the data flow. I cannot deploy the data set and the report to the test environment if the data flow has not been deployed to the test environment first. If I try to deploy the data set without having deployed the data flow, I will get an error message. Let's see this working. Let's see how this works. How we will demonstrate that. First, I have here, let me locate Power BI Summit Flow with one data flow. There is a button here when I look to a workspace, and this workspace is part of the pipeline. It shows to me which stage this workspace is. This is the development stage, and gives me a button View in Pipeline. So I can view this on the pipeline UI, and I can see I have a workflow on the development stage of this pipeline, and I have the test stage and the production stage that are empty, still empty. Okay. So I have another workspace here, PBI Flow DS. I don't have even a pipeline here yet. I have only the workspace. Here I'll publish a report and the dataset using that data flow. So create a relation between two pipelines. Let's call this as Flow DS pipeline. DS from dataset. And this first workspace will be the development workspace. So I have the second demonstration. This second demonstration is using the data flow. This second demonstration uses the data flow. So I'll publish to PBI Flow DS, which is the development stage of our Flow DS pipeline. Publishing. Okay. So it's published here. I can already see here the dataset and the report. I can already see both here. Let me check a refresh on the dataset. Everything is okay. Then I'll try to deploy to the test stage. Deploy to the test stage. What will happen? Can't start deployment. Why I can't start deployment? Because the data set on the test stage depends on a data flow. And the data flow is not on the test stage. So it refuses the deployment. It can't start the deployment. I need to deploy the data flow to the test stage first. So I use deployment pipelines here and go to flow pipeline. Here I have the data flow pipeline. Let's deploy to the test stage. Is deployed. In the same way that I defined the rules for a data set, I can define the rules for a data flow. Is the same. So I can define the rules for a data flow, changing the connection database, and I can define the parameters for the data flow as well. Okay, so it's advising that is different. Let's deploy again. To be sure that the rule is applied. Refresh the data flow. We can check on settings. It will not totally show the data source credentials. Oh, it's showing the data source credentials. It's using the showing more than one data flows inventory dev. No, I defined it there. Let's get back. Check the lineage. Let me double check the rule that I defined here. I defined dev and change for inventory. The lineage becomes a change to inventory. No, I'll change to inventory test. Sorry, that's my mistake. I changed it to inventory instead of changing to inventory test. Okay. Deploy. Refresh. Okay, settings. So now we see the inventory test. The data flow in a different way than the dataset show out the related credentials to it, but it will be using the one defined on the rule that I created on the environment. The point is now that I defined this on the environment, now I can make the deployment to the test environment of the report and the data set to the test environment. And now it didn't show the error. I don't have an error now. Okay, so I can check the report. So I need to make a refresh on the data set, just for the data set to adjust to the new links, new relations, and then check the report again. And I'll be seeing the report with the information from the test data flow. And the same will happen for production. The absolutely same will happen for production. Flow pipeline, I need to make a deploy of the data flow to the production environment. I define the rules. Adventure test, I will change to adventure. And parameter rules, add rules, starting price, 2000. Save. Okay. It shows a difference. I deploy again. Okay. Then I refresh the data flow. Once my data flow is in production, I can promote the data set and report to production as well. So in this last example, we are seeing two pipelines being promoted together and keeping their link. So the data set that I just promoted to production will be linked to the data flow in production on the other pipeline. I refresh the dataset to adjust the links, and it will access the data flow in production on the other pipeline. So we saw one individual pipeline and we promoted the objects in one individual pipeline, and we saw the relation between two different pipelines. I can tell you, Henry, why the system does not enforce the publish to dev only. But I can tell you that you can enforce that. You can adjust the workspace access in such a way that the developers can publish it to the development workspace only, and they can't publish it to the test workspace and the production workspace. So you can reach this result, Henry, but it's not enforced by default because what we see are only workspace, single workspace. But you can enforce that for the developers, managing the access to each workspace. Besides that, everything that I illustrated now was done manually. And that's not the only option that we have. We have a Power BI automation tools. It's still in preview, but is intended to be used with Azure DevOps to include this process, this flow of the objects among the Power BI pipeline in an Azure DevOps pipeline. So we can build an Azure DevOps pipeline to manage this flow of the objects among the Power BI pipeline. So you can automate this process using Power BI automation tools. And I also included some reference for the Power BI automation tools and for one article that also shows other ways to automate using PowerShell, for example. You can automate using PowerShell. Any additional questions? No?
Thank you so much, Dennis. That was very insightful. I appreciate your sharing your knowledge and experience with the group here. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Just on time.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone liked it. And let me leave everyone with my contacts again. And as I said in the beginning, it will be a pleasure to stay in touch.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you. Appreciate it.